what I need to do here is create a new scribe panel line right along here where the resin piece meets the plastic, and there's obviously filler here, so when I had to sand all this, of course it just kind of sanded smooth. So I'm going to use the plastic where the plastic ends as a guide for my tape line, so that way I have a guide that will follow that, and of course it will go all the way around and it will stop here at the bottom. And what I'll do is, if it's possible to see, there's a panel line here that's already from the kit, so I'm going to have those connect, and that should create a good panel line for the break between the intake and the body of the airplane. So of course, first we have to gather our tools, and I've got this is labeling tape, and you can get this under the Dymo brand. This one is I think it's made by Scotch, and it's basically the same stuff. It's kind of a thicker plastic that when the label makers press their letters into it, it creates an impression and comes out white, just like when you kind of bend plastic. But in its current form, it's too thick or too wide. So first thing I need to do is cut it into strips. So I'm laying it on a piece of glass here, and then I'm going to cut it into approximately, it doesn't have to be exact, just something around 1 millimeter strips. I use a fresh blade. Sometimes it takes more than one pass. You got to make sure you press down with the ruler, otherwise the tape will slightly move on you. And I'm going to give myself a few strips. Again, just close enough. The reason why I cut it into thinner strips is that when it's really wide, it's not very flexible. And so when it's thinner, it flexes much better around compound curves and whatnot, allows me to, it gives a little bit more flexibility. It's not as flexible as tape, as like masking tape, Tamiya tape, but Tamiya tape and masking tape doesn't have enough of an edge to follow, and it's very difficult to follow or to scribe your lines with those types of tape. So I'm just cutting myself several pieces, because the adhesive on this is only good for about 2 or 3 uses before it just doesn't have any more tact, and will start to lift as you scribe. So there we go. I'm going to put my glass away, ruler away, and the extra tape away. Now I've got a few pieces here, and let's grab the scribing tools. Now I have 3 main scribing tools that I like. This is the classic hook. This one happens to be by Trumpeter, but there's a bunch of other ones that are made out there. I think this one is, this one's Tamiya, which is basically the same concept, and then there's other brands too. This is my personal favorite, which is a razor saw by, I think this one's by CMK, and JLC also makes a razor saw like this. You can use it with or without the handle. Some of the razor saws come with a much finer tooth on one side than the other side, so that way it can give you a different cut, a more aggressive cut or a much finer cut. And then of course the classic needle in a pin vise. This is just a sewing needle. At the dollar store, it comes in a pack of like 20 or 30 needles, and I just chuck it into the pin vise. I keep it very short so that the needle does not flex, and I usually start with this just to give me a guideline, and you'll see that here shortly, and then I'll continue with this one. These other two I tend not to use unless I'm having trouble or I need a thicker line. These gouge deeply, quickly, and can sometimes get out of control. So these take a little bit more practice than the other two. The other two are more forgiving. These also are much more difficult to use around curves and trying to do any kind of compound curves or going around, especially going around the perimeter here, going from the top to the bottom of the aircraft. These are more difficult to use than the razor saw or even the pin vise. Now the pin vise, the biggest drawback there is you're not actually cutting, you are gouging. So you're essentially creating an indentation of the plastic, which is going to create a valley essentially and raise the plastic on the sides of the indentation. So that will then later have to be sanded down, which of course makes more dust and whatnot. But I'll show you how you can clean that up as well. And there's some cleaning and sanding techniques that I use at the end. So let's start first with the Dymo tape here. I'm going to put on my magnifying glasses so that I can see the work up close. And then of course we start by just separating the tape or the backing paper from the adhesive side. There we go. Peel that away. All right. So I'm going to try and use the cleanest edge that I have here. Now, starting from that natural seam line that we talked about, I'm going to place this starting with that. Now, the seam here that I have filled is with super glue. Super glue doesn't shrink. It's excellent for scribing. Unlike putty fillers, which the putty fillers tend to crack and break as you scribe them, the CA glue, super glue, does not do that. It scribes very much like the plastic itself. So I prefer scribing super glue than anything else, other than of course the plastic itself. So there we go. I've got now a line I'm going to follow. I'm going to follow on this inside part here where it meets the resin piece, and I just kind of press it down with my thumb as tight as I can. I don't know if it shows in the camera here, but right here where it curves and goes around, it doesn't quite sit as flat, but that's okay because it's just a guide, and you can try to press it down, but it's not a big deal. You'll see here in a second what I'm talking about. So there we go. Now I've got my guide. I'm going to grab my pin vise. I'm trying to make this in the camera here. The first few passes are very light, barely any pressure, and it is to try to start creating a line that later the razor saw or one of the other tools can follow, but this way the needle doesn't jump, and it's much easier to follow the guide because you're not putting a lot of pressure. And you can see I'm not doing this in one continuous pass. I first started on the top, and now I'm going around the curve here. And you can see the needle follows without any problem. But again, I've only got about 1/4 inch of the needle sticking out of the pin vise, because if I do any more than that, it flexes as I go around. And then here on the bottom half, I'm going to go the other direction, starting from the end of the panel line and go and meet the other one. And I don't know if you can hear that. There's a scraping sound, which lets me know it is digging. And I can see kind of some dust building up, so I know it's digging. This is a very tedious and slow-paced work. Usually if I have to rescribe an entire model, entire aircraft, I do it before. It's the first thing I do before I do any assembly. It's much easier to work with the individual pieces than to try to do a partially assembled wing or fuselage and scribe. And it can take me, depending on the size of the aircraft, it can take me upwards of 2 to 3, maybe even 4 or 5 evenings, weekends, that kind of thing, to scribe everything. So there we go. Now I've got a panel line, and I'm going to try to get the camera to pick it up if I can. I'm not sure that it's going to do a very good job. But there is something there that the next tool will be able to find and follow. So now I'm going to grab my razor saw here, and I'm going to use the side that has the finer teeth. So you can see one side, this side here, has the more jagged teeth, rougher teeth, and the other side has much finer teeth. So I'm going to find that line. There it is, just dropped right in, and I'm going to follow along, and again, very light pressure. This is a little difficult doing it under a camera, so I'm trying not to let it jump. Usually I do this under very strong light. And then here's where the saw is superior to most of the other tools, is coming around that corner, or from the top to the bottom. It can follow that curve much better than, for example, if I try to use that hook, it's much harder to guide it around. I'm not putting any oops, let's get that in the camera. I'm not putting any pressure here, and it's just almost impossible to keep it in that groove. But the saw naturally follows that line beautifully. Again, very light pressure. You can see I'm doing this in several passes. You can see I start from the outside, lightly drag it, and wait for it to hit that panel line that I created with the pin vise. Slowly dragging. And as I get to the flatter side, I change and try to use a little bit more of the tip of the saw than the flat end of it, because that allows me to guide it a little bit easier. You can go in either direction depending on how the saw is dragging. Sometimes you got to pull, sometimes you got to push, and as the line gets deeper, you can then start going in both directions. As you can see, this is one panel line, one side that I've done in very slow, tedious work. Now I'm going to start going a little deeper, trying to match the depth of the natural panel lines that have been molded into the kit. And it's never exact, you know. Sometimes my panel lines are a little deeper than the kit itself, but when it's all said and done, you really can't tell. As long as the panel line is not super deep or really wide compared to the other panel lines near it. And at 48th scale and even at 72nd scale, I find that the razor saw most closely matches the same scale panel lines as most kits. Obviously going in different directions. Now, if the reason why I do it in multiple light passes is that if the tool jumps and goes off the plastic or off the scribe line, it's easy to sand out a very shallow mess up than it is a deep one. Because if I'm pushing down really hard and this jumps, it's going to put a deep scratch into the adjacent plastic, and that is going to require me to fill with super glue and re-sand it down and try to get it all flattened out and everything like that. But if it's a very light line, that's easy to sand out with a few passes of sandpaper, and it disappears without a trace, without me having to fill. All right, I think we are pretty good here. It's definitely catching much easier now, which means the panel line is much deeper. And I'm just kind of doing final passes. Okay, so again, with the knife, it has cut into the plastic, so there's dust there, which is good. That's what I want, as opposed to the pin vise, which would just create a groove and push the material off to the side. So when I run my finger over this, I can actually feel there's, it feels very much like the panel lines everywhere else, where you basically can't feel them unless you run your nail across them. Same thing here, my nail will catch it, but when I run my finger over it, it's almost non-existent. Sometimes I will sand this anyway with like an 800 or 1000 grit paper, very light passes. Let me grab some paper, and I'll usually wet sand it so that there's less dust involved in catching inside the channel. So here's a sanding stick, and I just dipped it in some water and just a few passes around the entire panel line. Now, a way you can check the panel line to see your progress if you're having trouble seeing it is to take a little bit of silver paint and just take with a brush and put it and paint right over the panel line, and that will highlight that panel line and see what kind of progress you're getting there. So if you can't see it, that's an excellent tip to see it. And then of course when you're ready to paint, just sand the silver paint as flat as possible to make sure that you didn't create a ridge with your or brush strokes with your paint and your brush. So there we go. One panel line done. Take a rag to dry off the water. And now I can run my finger over it and feel it. It feels just like the adjacent plastic and the adjacent panel lines. But when I run my nail, I can feel it catching. So there's a panel line there, just like the panel lines at the rest of the plastic. There's one there now. So the final thing I will do is to get rid of any remaining dust that is caught in the panel line itself is I will take good old, there we go, good old extra thin Tamiya. I will get rid of as much of the glue as possible off the brush to the point where the brush is just wet but not dripping. And then I will run my brush right over that panel line. And that essentially dissolves all the dust that's still possibly caught in the panel line. So I'm going to grab some silver paint and paint it so that hopefully it'll look a little bit better on the camera here. All right, so here we go. Oops, classic. What is this? Just, you know, aluminum, silver. I don't even know what color it is. It's just some kind of silver. It's probably steel or aluminum. Square bottle testers that I've had forever. So shook it up a little bit. Got just a inexpensive brush here, nothing fancy. Take a little bit out of the cap. Make sure it's not too thick. And I am going to just run it right where I scribed, and hopefully the camera will show that. So let's see, I'm going to try a few different angles here. There, I think you can kind of see it in the reflection as it comes around. There we go, that's a good shot there. There's a panel line. Straight, flat, and once I do the other side, there we go. And once it's all painted and everything like that, you never know that those are two separate materials, resin intake and plastic. And doing another shot under a little bit stronger light, that hoping that the camera will pick up the panel line, which it looks like it is. So there we go, you can see that real nice. Now, if you mess up and it goes deep, your tool jumps the panel line and it scratches deep. If sanding doesn't work, wet sanding, you have to wet sand it, not dry sand. You want to wet sand it because the paper won't fill up with dust and create more scratches. You can wet sand any area, and then if that doesn't fix it, you take a little bit of thin super glue, CA glue, not the gel, but the thin stuff, and you try to fill in any of the scratches that you created where you didn't want them. And then you'll have to go back, wet sand that flat, and match the plastic. Usually you want to stick with 600 or 800 grit wet dry sandpaper. You don't want to go to 400 or deeper, otherwise you're just going to make even more scratches. The plastic is soft. You don't want to have super aggressive paper. And then if the scratch crosses any of other panel lines, and so you'll have to sand it, and then of course you may have to go back and correct where you may have sanded away some of the other detail or whatnot, where it just doesn't look right. Like for example, if my knife had jumped across, there's a panel line right here that runs you know, towards the in and outside of the airplane here, and if it had gone across that, I'd have to sand it, and then of course I'd have to go and find that panel line and correct it with the knife by just scribing it back in. But it would scribe just the same as the area that we did up here. Hopefully that helps you guys, and that is the basics of how I scribe an entire plane if I have to. Of course, I would take my my tape, my Dymo tape, and for longer runs, of course, I would cut much longer runs so that I can do it in one pass. And then, of course, where panel lines intersect, that's all kind of it comes with experience on how to get those panel lines to intersect, and you'll just have to play with the lengths of tape. You know, you can, like some I've done some models where I'll do all one direction first, and then I'll come back and do the other direction. Some places it doesn't work like that. If the wings have a weird shape or the body of the airplane has a weird shape, then I may have to kind of play around with that and work with different angles and whatnot. And then again, I almost always have to go back and repair with super glue, and I've always got jumps and marks. I've gotten much better at it where I'm not, you know, completely cleaning up the entire model. I'll usually have maybe just a handful, and it's mostly due to using this tool as my primary scribing tool. It is much more forgiving. It goes around curves much better, and it leaves a much finer detail. And of course, starting with the pin vise as my starting point. And sometimes I have started with this if I know that this will do the job, but I tend not to start with this first because I like the way that this follows the tape much better than the knife. But that's personal preference. That is really up to you and how you feel. There's no right or wrong here, guys. You know, you can play with the different tools, see which one you like. I mean, I've seen guys use these hook style knives or scribers and do an entire plane and do a great job. I don't like it. It's okay, but it's not my go-to. But these are inexpensive. You can usually get them under $10 for one of these guys. The last thing I do is when I'm done scribing an entire part or plane or whatever, that is where I will then of course wet sand the entire surface to try to even out everything. I'll have some dust, of course, in there. I'll let it dry out. Sometimes I take an old toothbrush and try to get as much of the dust out as I can, and then I'll go to my Tamiya thin. And again, this is important because you don't want globs of glue getting everywhere and distorting the plastic or creating, you know, issues or fingerprints if you touch the wrong place, and now you're going back and sanding and rescribing and fixing and all that nonsense. So you want to keep this very thin on the brush. You know, basically just enough to dissolve the dust that's in the panel lines. That's all you need. And if you're not sure if it's going to do that, then just go with a toothbrush or something and wash it out. You can even run your model or your part under the sink and just let the water run it all out too. So if you're not to this point where I've got some paint work done and everything like that, I wouldn't want to put this under the sink. But if it's just a single part, you can easily put that under the sink. Then I'll go into another part of the video where I will show you about getting rid of panel lines, especially raised panel lines and rivets, how to get rid of those, but how to leave enough of it there as a guide so that you're not having to, if you don't want to use drawings of panel lines and having to take a pencil and draw your new panel lines in to figure out where they're going to be, but using the existing ghost of the raised panel line as your guide. Obviously, they're not always accurate, but you know, you're going for that panel line look, but you're not necessarily, you don't really care that it's perfectly accurate. There's a way you can use the existing raised panel lines as a guide, and I'll get into that in another part of the video. Thank you. Enjoy, guys, and as always, keep building.